Something just happened that is going to change the entire balance of power in the Middle East. And most people have absolutely no idea how significant this really is. The US Army did not just strike a few missile sites overnight. What happened in the last several hours represents one of the most comprehensive, most coordinated, and most devastating precision strike campaigns ever executed against a nation-state's offensive weapons infrastructure. And I am going to walk you through every single layer of what we know, what it means, and why the world woke up to a fundamentally different strategic reality this morning. Before I get into it, let me tell you who I am and why I'm the right person to break this down for you. I am Ryan, former F-15E Strike Eagle combat pilot, former F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and current airline captain on the Boeing 737 and Airbus A220. I've planned strike packages, I've executed precision weapons deliveries, and I understand both the tactical and doctrinal dimensions of what a military operation like this actually requires to pull off. This is not speculation from a think tank. This is a professional pilot's read on a real-world strike campaign, and the details matter enormously. Here is what I'm going to cover in this video, and I want to roadmap it clearly because there is a lot to unpack. First, I'm going to explain what Iran's missile program actually was, what it consisted of, why it was uniquely dangerous, and what made it so difficult to neutralize. Second, I'm going to walk through what the US Army reportedly executed overnight, the assets, the sequencing, and the target sets that were hit. Third, I'm going to give you my honest pilot's take on what this means strategically, what remains unconfirmed, and what every person watching this needs to understand about the days that come next. Let me start with the context, because without it, you cannot understand the magnitude of what just happened. Iran's ballistic missile program was not just a military capability. It was the central pillar of a deterrent strategy that TAN had spent decades and billions of dollars constructing with extraordinary discipline and patience. The Iranians understood a very long time ago that they could not match the United States or Israel in terms of conventional air power, naval power, or ground force projection. So, they made a deliberate strategic choice to invest almost everything into a standoff strike capability that could threaten their adversaries from Iranian territory without requiring air superiority to deliver. That is a critically important point, and I want you to sit with it for a second. Iran did not need jets to threaten Israel, Saudi Arabia, US bases in Qatar, or American carrier strike groups operating in the Gulf. They built a library of ballistic missiles, some short-range, some medium-range, and some with ranges that put European targets theoretically within reach. And they dispersed those capabilities across hardened underground facilities, mobile launcher systems, and concealed storage sites throughout the country. The entire architecture was designed to survive a first strike and still be able to retaliate with meaningful damaging force. The Shahab series, the Fate series, the Zulfagar, the Cham, the corded air defense integration. These were not just individual weapons programs. They represented a layered, interconnected deterrence ecosystem that Iran had spent 30 years building, refining, testing, and dispersing. The underground missile cities, and I want to flag that term as something Iranian commanders themselves used publicly, were engineered specifically to frustrate exactly the kind of targeting problem that any adversary would face trying to neutralize this capability. Some of these facilities were bored hundreds of meters into mountainsides, reinforced with multiple blast doors, and worked to command and control infrastructure that was itself hardened and redundant. Now here is where I want to be really clear about what made this so difficult from a military planning standpoint, because this is where the professional pilot perspective actually matters. When you are planning a strike package against a hardened underground facility, you're not just choosing a weapon and picking a coordinate. You're working through a problem set that involves penetration requirements, the angle of attack needed to achieve the right terminal trajectory, the fusing options available, and whether you have enough time on target with the right munitions before the window closes. And against an adversary who has spent 30 years thinking about exactly how you would try to attack them. Every one of those planning variables has been complicated deliberately and by design. The Iranians studied American and Israeli strike doctrine carefully. They watched what happened in Iraq in 1991 and in 2003. They watched what the Israelis did in Syria. They watched every publicly available after-action analysis of every major precision strike campaign conducted in the last 4 decades. And they reverse-engineered the vulnerabilities in that doctrine into their own survivability architecture. That is not something that can be overcome with a few cruise missiles on a Tuesday night, or so everyone assumed until this morning. Let me be fair and balanced here, because I think that intellectual honesty is critically important in a situation like this. What we know right now is still developing. The initial reporting is significant and credible. But in my experience with these kinds of events, the first 12 to 24 hours of information are always a mix of confirmed reality, battlefield confusion, psychological operations, and genuine uncertainty. I am going to tell you what appears to be confirmed, and I'm going to flag very clearly where I think we are still operating in the fog of war. What the reporting indicates is that the U.S. Army, and specifically elements operating in coordination with Air Force and Navy assets, executed a multi-phase, multi-domain strike operation targeting Iran's ballistic missile production, storage, and launch infrastructure across multiple geographic nodes simultaneously. The word simultaneously is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and I want to emphasize it. Simultaneous strikes across geographically distributed targets is one of the most logistically demanding operations a military can execute because it requires precise coordination of timing, deconfliction of airspace, synchronized weapon arrivals, and real-time intelligence sharing across every platform involved. This is not something you improvise. This is the product of months, possibly years, of detailed planning, rehearsal, and intelligence preparation of the battlefield. Now, I want to talk about the assets that have been reported as part of this operation, and I want to note that some of this is confirmed and some of this is preliminary. The Army's role here is actually the most interesting part of this story to me from a doctrinal standpoint. When most people think about a major strike operation, they think about Air Force bombers, Navy carrier air wings, Tomahawk missiles launched from destroyers. The Army's contribution to long-range precision fires has historically been more limited in scope, which makes the framing of this particular operation and the Army's central role in it genuinely significant. The precision strike missile known as PRSM is one of the weapons I want to highlight here, and I want to flag that its reported employment in this context is something I cannot independently confirm at this moment. PRSM represents a generational leap in Army long-range fires capability. It has a range that significantly exceeds its predecessor, the ATA-CMS, and it has been designed from the ground up with the kind of precision and lethality needed to engage hardened and time-sensitive targets. If PRSM was employed in this operation in the numbers and against the target set being reported, that is a genuinely historic employment of a relatively new weapon system and exactly the kind of high-end conflict scenario it was designed for. I also want to talk about the intelligence and targeting dimension of this because I think people underestimate how much of the operational success of a strike campaign like this lives in the intelligence domain. Hitting mobile missile launchers is categorically different from hitting a fixed facility. Mobile systems are by definition not where you last saw them. And the Iranian missile force has invested significantly in mobile launcher survivability through dispersal, concealment under netting and in tunnels, and through operational patterns designed to frustrate collection. To strike mobile systems successfully, you need persistent fused intelligence from multiple collection disciplines. And you need the decision cycle compressed to the point where you can act on a targeting solution before the window closes. That is a description of a capability the United States has been building and refining for decades, and it has reached a level of maturity that was simply not achievable even 15 years ago. The fusion of signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, human intelligence, and space-based collection into a real-time targeting picture that can drive precision weapons employment is arguably the most significant military technology development of the last 2 decades. And it does not get enough attention in public discussions about military capability. What it enables and what the overnight strikes appear to represent is the ability to compress the kill chain against even highly mobile and dispersed targets to the point where survivability through mobility becomes a much less reliable strategy. And that should be genuinely alarming to every military planner who has been counting on mobility as a primary survivability mechanism. Now let me talk about the sequencing of this operation, because the order of events in a strike campaign of this complexity matters enormously. Before you can strike the primary targets, the launchers, the storage sites, the production facilities, you have to do something about the air defenses that protect them. Iran's integrated air defense network is serious, layered, and has been significantly enhanced over the last decade with Russian-supplied systems and indigenous Iranian development programs. The Bavar 373 system, the S-300 derivatives in Iranian service, and the layered network of shorter-range interceptors represent a real obstacle to any strike package. And any credible account of a successful overnight operation has to explain how that obstacle was addressed. The most likely answer involves a combination of suppression of enemy air defenses operations, what we call SAD in the military, electronic warfare, and potentially cyber operations designed to degrade or blind the Iranian air picture before the primary strike package arrived. This is a sequencing problem that the U.S. military has rehearsed and executed many times over the last 30 years. But doing it against Iran's level of air defense investment is qualitatively different from the kinds of adversaries it has been done against in the past, and the apparent success of the operation, if the early reporting holds, represents a significant validation of current SCAD and electronic warfare doctrine against a serious modern air defense network. I want to be careful here because the honest answer is that we do not yet know exactly how the air defense piece was handled, and I think that detail is going to be one of the most operationally significant takeaways from this event once the full picture emerges. Let me shift now to what I think is the most important strategic question raised by what happened overnight. Iran's missile program was not just a military deterrent, it was the backbone of the entire Iranian deterrent strategy against both Israel and the United States, and it was the primary means by which Iran projected coercive power throughout the region. The healthy missile and drone attacks on Israel and on commercial shipping in the Red Sea, the Hezbollah rocket and missile arsenal in Lebanon, the various proxy force rocket programs across Iraq and Syria, all of these were downstream expressions of the Iranian missile doctrine and were enabled, equipped, and in many cases supplied directly by the Iranian missile program we are discussing. If the overnight strikes have done what the initial reporting suggests they have done, the strategic implications extend far beyond Iran's own territory. The proxy deterrence architecture that Iran spent decades constructing, what the Iranians and their strategists called the axis of resistance, was built on the foundation of a credible Iranian retaliatory strike capability that could hold American interests and allies at risk if anyone challenged Iranian or proxy interests directly. That deterrence chain only works if the foundational strike capability is survivable, credible, and deliverable. If the overnight operation has fundamentally degraded Iran's ability to conduct large-scale ballistic missile strikes, the entire proxy deterrence architecture becomes structurally weaker overnight because the ultimate backstop that gave it its coercive power is now in serious question. That is a massive strategic shift, and I want to be careful not to overstate it. But I also want to be clear that if this is what it appears to be, we are looking at a fundamental restructuring of the regional deterrence environment. Now, here's where I want to flag some important caveats, because I think this is where the intellectually honest part of the analysis gets really critical. Military operations are almost never as clean and complete as the initial reporting suggests. The history of strike campaigns, including the most successful ones in recent memory, is a history of assessed effects that look different when the smoke clears, and the intelligence picture solidifies over the following days and weeks. What gets called destroyed in the first 24 hours of reporting is not always what the post-strike battle damage assessment confirms. Iran has spent an enormous amount of effort on the redundancy and dispersal of its missile program precisely because it understood that this day might come. There are almost certainly elements of the Iranian missile program that were not targeted or that were targeted and survived or that were simply not known to U.S. targeting cells at the time the strike packages were built. I am not saying this to minimize what happened. If even half of what is being reported holds up under rigorous battle damage assessment, this is still a historic and consequential military operation. But I want to be fair and balanced. And the fair and balanced read is that we are almost certainly not looking at complete elimination. We are looking at a massive and probably decisive degradation of a capability that Iran took decades to build. Let me talk for a moment about what this means for the people inside those systems, the pilots, the crews, the soldiers who planned and executed this operation, because I think that dimension gets lost when we talk about strategy and doctrine. This operation required people to fly into some of the most dangerous airspace in the world, against air defenses that have been specifically designed to shoot down the kinds of aircraft that are in the United States inventory. It required Army crews to operate long-range fire systems under conditions of real adversarial threat to trust their intelligence picture, trust their weapons, and trust the deconliction and coordination structure that kept them from running into each other in a very busy and lethal piece of airspace. And it required the intelligence analysts, the planners, the logisticians, and the commanders who built this operation to make thousands of decisions correctly under enormous time pressure with incomplete information, knowing that the cost of errors would be measured in lives. That is what operational excellence actually looks like from the inside. It is not a clean PowerPoint briefing with neat arrows on a map. It is thousands of human beings making high-stakes decisions correctly, consistently in the dark against an adversary who is actively trying to defeat you. The fact that this operation appears to have been executed with the level of success being reported is a testament to years of training, planning, rehearsal, and professional development across every element of the joint force that was involved. And I say that as someone who has been part of strike package planning, who has sat in those rooms and worked those problems, and who knows what it actually takes to do this right now. I want to talk about Iran's likely response because that is the question that is probably on everyone's mind right now. And I want to be very direct here. I do not know what Iran is going to do. And I am deeply skeptical of anyone who claims certainty about Iranian decision-making in the immediate aftermath of an operation of this magnitude. What I can tell you is how I think about the decision space that Iranian leadership now faces and what the realistic options and constraints look like from a professional military perspective. Iran's immediate retaliatory options are significantly constrained by the degradation of the very capability that was their primary retaliatory instrument. If the ballistic missile program has been substantially degraded, Iran cannot respond in kind. The residual missile inventory, whatever survived the overnight strikes, will now be used with extreme caution because it represents an asset that cannot easily be replaced and that Iran knows is now a high-priority target set for additional strikes if used provocatively. What that leaves is the proxy network, the drone force, and the naval harassment capability in the Gulf, none of which represent the kind of strategic deterrent that the ballistic missile program did. Iran can create noise, it can create risk, it can threaten commercial shipping, and attempt to make the Gulf untenable for maritime traffic. But none of that is equivalent to the strategic coercive power that the overnight strikes appear to have removed. There's also the domestic political dimension inside Iran that matters here. The Iranian leadership has built enormous legitimacy, particularly with its hardline constituencies on the narrative of strategic power and deterrence. The missile program was a central pillar of that narrative, and the overnight strikes represent a direct attack on the credibility of that narrative in a way that will reverberate inside Iranian domestic politics for a long time. How the leadership chooses to manage that narrative, whether through aggressive rhetoric, through calibrated retaliation, or through a period of tactical restraint while attempting to reconstitute, is a question that even the best Iran analysts in the world are going to be working through in the coming days. I want to spend a few minutes now on the technology dimension of this because there are several platforms and weapon systems involved in this operation that I think deserve specific attention. The Army Tactical Missile System and its successor, the Precision Strike Missile, represent a fundamental shift in how the Army contributes to joint strike operations. For most of the post-Cold War period, the Army's deep fires capability was relatively limited in range and was primarily oriented towards support of ground maneuver forces rather than theater-level strike operations. The development and fielding of PRSM represents a deliberate decision to give the Army a long-range precision strike capability that can contribute to the joint deep fight in exactly the kind of scenario we are discussing. The multi-domain operations concept that the Army has been developing and refining over the last decade is precisely the doctrinal framework that this kind of operation reflects. The idea that Army long-range fires can contribute alongside Air Force and Navy strike assets to achieve theater-level effects against a sophisticated adversary is not new as a concept. But this operation, if the reporting is accurate, represents one of the most significant real-world validations of that concept that we have seen. The implication for how we think about Army contributions to high-end conflict is significant, and I think it is going to reshape a lot of conversations in defense planning circles about how to resource and develop Army long-range fires capability going forward. This is the kind of operational evidence that ends procurement debates in ways that no amount of wargaming and modeling can. Let me also address something that I know is going to come up in the comment section, which is the question of international law and the legal basis for an operation of this magnitude. I am going to be honest with you. I'm not an international law expert, and I'm not going to pretend to give you a definitive legal analysis. What I can tell you is that these are real questions that will be debated, that the U.S. government will provide legal justification, and that whether you agree with that justification or not is a genuinely legitimate policy question that reasonable people can disagree on. I try to keep this channel focused on the operational and strategic dimensions of military events, and on those dimensions, I can speak with professional authority. On the legal and policy dimensions, I want to be honest that my expertise has limits. What I can say is that the nature of the Iranian missile threat, the attacks on U.S. forces in the region, the attacks on Israel, the proxy escalation that has occurred over the last several years, provides a factual backdrop against which the U.S. government will make its legal and policy case. Whether that case is persuasive to every observer is a separate question from whether the operation was militarily executed successfully. I am going to focus on the military dimensions because that is where I can actually add value, and I trust the people watching this channel to form their own views on the policy and legal questions with full awareness of the complexity involved. That is the fair and balanced approach that I try to bring to every event I cover on this channel. Now let me talk about the regional implications beyond Iran itself, because I think this is where some of the most important long-term consequences of this operation are going to play out. Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the other Gulf states have been living under the shadow of Iranian ballistic missile capability for decades. The ability of Iran to strike their cities, their infrastructure, and their military installations with ballistic missiles that are very difficult to intercept has shaped every aspect of their defense planning, their force development investments, and their strategic relationships with the United States. If the overnight strikes have fundamentally altered that threat picture, The strategic calculus for every one of those states changes significantly. For Israel specifically, this matters in a way that goes beyond the immediate military dimension. The periodic ballistic missile salvos from Iran, most recently during the significant exchanges of 2024 and 2025, required enormous investment in missile defense, created real psychological strain on the Israeli population, and consumed Israeli military resources that could have been directed elsewhere. If the source of those salvos has been substantially degraded, Israel's strategic bandwidth for dealing with other challenges, Lebanon, Gaza, the West Bank, and beyond, expands in ways that are hard to overstate. The downstream effect on regional dynamics from that single variable is enormous. For Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the implications are similarly significant. Both countries have faced real and credible ballistic missile threats from Iranian-backed Houthi forces in Yemen, and those threats have been enabled by Iranian missile technology, Iranian components, and Iranian strategic direction. The overnight strikes targeted the source of that enabling capacity. And if the battle damage assessment confirms the effects being reported, the Houthi missile and drone threat to Saudi and Emirati territory is going to look significantly different in the months ahead. Whether that translates into a strategic opportunity for a durable settlement in Yemen is a political question, but the military conditions for one may have shifted dramatically overnight. I want to take a step back now and put this in a broader historical context because I think that context matters for understanding why this moment is genuinely significant even beyond the immediate tactical and strategic dimensions. The history of attempts to destroy ballistic missile programs through military force is not encouraging. The Great Escud Hunt of the Gulf War in 1991 is the canonical example, an enormous effort with significant resources that succeeded in suppressing Scud launches, but did not achieve the complete destruction of Iraq's mobile missile capability. Every subsequent analysis of that campaign has pointed to the fundamental difficulty of targeting mobile dispersed systems with any confidence of complete destruction. What appears to have happened overnight is different in kind, not just in degree from the Scud Hunt. The combination of mature, fused intelligence capabilities, long-range precision weapons with the ability to hit hardened underground facilities, simultaneous multi-domain strike operations that prevented Iran from dispersing or reconcealing its assets, and the apparent success of the air defense suppression mission, if all of that holds up, represents a genuine leap in the ability of the U.S. military to solve exactly the targeting problem that has defeated every previous attempt at this kind of comprehensive missile neutralization. That is not a small thing. That is a fundamental change in what is militarily achievable against a determined adversary who has spent decades trying to build an unsolvable targeting problem. And I want to land on this point for a moment because I think it is the most important operational lesson from this event, regardless of how the political and strategic dimensions play out. The assumption that dispersal, hardening, mobility, and redundancy would make a ballistic missile program effectively unsolvable as a targeting problem has been the foundation of Iranian deterrence strategy for 30 years. The overnight strikes, if the initial reporting reflects the actual operational outcome, suggest that assumption may no longer be valid. And if that assumption is invalid for Iran, it has profound implications for every other state actor that has built its deterrent strategy on the same foundation. Let me give you my bottom line because I think you deserve a direct answer and not just a list of factors to weigh. What appears to have happened overnight is a decisive multi-domain precision strike operation that has substantially degraded Iran's ballistic missile production, storage, and launch infrastructure in a single operational period. If the battle damage assessment confirms the early reporting, and I want to be clear that we do not yet have that confirmed picture, this represents the most consequential single military operation in the Middle East in at least a generation, and possibly in the entire post-Cold War era. The strategic implications for Iranian deterrence, for regional security, for U.S. military doctrine, and for the global proliferation calculus are going to be debated and analyzed for years. Iran is not eliminated as a threat, it retains significant residual military capability, a large and motivated proxy network, and a leadership that has repeatedly demonstrated the willingness to absorb significant pain rather than fundamentally change its strategic direction. But the primary instrument of its coercive power, the ballistic missile program that it built at enormous cost over 3 decades, has been fundamentally compromised in a single night. And that is a strategic fact that no amount of rhetoric can undo. The days ahead are going to be tense. The Iranian response is going to be watched with enormous attention, and the full picture of what happened overnight is going to take time to come fully into focus. But the direction of the strategic shift is clear, and it is historic. I want to hear from you in the comments below about what you think the most important implication of this operation is. Is it the Iranian deterrence question, the proxy network question, or the doctrinal implications for how we think about Army long-range fires in the joint fight? Drop your answer below, because the conversation in this comment section is going to be one of the best places to watch the analysis develop in real time as more information comes out. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. The story is going to evolve rapidly in the coming days, and I'm going to be here with professional analysis as every new piece of the picture comes into focus. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next one.